Hi, this is Chris from Orange Coast College's art department, doing a value study using eggs in a still life lighting setup. In previous videos, we've looked at how to create a still life value study setup and also how to arrange eggs. And so I've already arranged the eggs and they look a little bit like this that you're looking at. What I want to do now is begin the drawing and go through the steps for doing that. So just to let you know, what you're looking at is on a black textured blanket, and I think I'm going to adjust the value of that to be a little lighter, not significantly, but not so it's the darkest thing and everything is really high contrast against it. So I'm going to lower the value a little bit, but otherwise kind of proceed with what you see here. So I'm going to do our typical steps, which is I'm going to overall get an envelope of what I see, hopefully about the same proportion. It's a triangle with the apex somewhere in the middle there. And then I'm going to do that really lightly with my 4H pencil. And then I'm going to want to find each of the 6 eggs and try to lightly get the outline for each. So I can kind of get my shape and proportion down initially. So I'm doing this at probably 3 times the egg size, maybe even 4 times. And I'm just looking at going back and forth between the negative space and the positive space, drawing as light as I can here initially. This is probably hard to pick up on video, but I'm just holding the pencil very light back in the rear part of the pencil and finding those shapes. I think I've got most of them except for this guy on the right. So I'm feeling pretty good there. And I'm going to go ahead, because I'm building up, sort of creating the form from a light line. I'm going to go ahead and just draw a little bit darker to get the final. Because these are eggs, they're going to be pretty forgiving. You know, there's a pointed end and a less pointed end. And they're generally symmetrical. There's a longer axis and a shorter axis, but they're pretty forgiving. This guy with the lost edge back here is a little harder to see. All right, so you can probably start seeing these lines now. And, oh, these guys meet. So I gotta bring him down a little bit. Missed that initially. I'm gonna go ahead and do a little cleanup. That top's going to need a little repair. Wrong pencil. All right, so pretty quick, that's my light lay-in. So again, using my H pencil, I'm gonna find those lines until I like them. I'll keep working with it. So there's my eggs, and I should catch my cast shadows as well. So they're really hard to tell against this black blanket, but I'm gonna go ahead and make them a little bit more obvious when I lighten the background slightly. So again, it's a little harder to read right now, but I think it'll get a little easier once it's complete. So cast shadows on the ground. That's what we're going after right here. And then we're going to want to do some cast shadows on the eggs. So this guy is casting a little shadow, and the egg on top is casting a little shadow in there as well. Then there's some lost edges here. And I've got sort of a double shadow going on because of the wide focus of the light I was using for the setup. So I'm just going to pick the bigger of the two. And then lastly, I'm going to want to really lightly find the terminator on each of the eggs. And if we remember our sphere shading, the terminator is where the light stops hitting the egg completely from the main light source. So in this egg, this area is receiving light. The surface of the egg is falling away till it's parallel with the light, and that's our halftone. And then terminator is where it's not getting any more light. So I kind of want to find those guys because I want to be able to establish my core shadow pretty early on. And then there'll be some reflected light, so it's okay to kind of figure out where the core shadow is going to be. All right, so I think I'm pretty set up here. This is what I'd call my setup. I've got my outline of my eggs. I've got my cast shadows both on the ground plane and on the other eggs. And then I've got my terminator and a bit of the corresponding core shadow reflected light area going on here. So next is I'm going to be flipping over to my 6B pencil to do sort of the final shading. All right, do we all remember this? Here's our value scales, both in graphite and in charcoal. I'm going to be using graphite for this version of the eggs. And looking at my still life, I've probably got a little bit of 10 maybe way back here in my sort of lost edge, cast shadow, occlusion shadow, just all darkness going on there as well as here. And so this might be some 10, but this will probably be the only 10, that and in this deep hole here. But for the most part, as I move out, we're going to be in the 9s and above. And I'll figure out at the end where we want to do our background, but it'll probably be the 6, 7, 8, something like that. But it's a good idea to sort of map these out. So I know I'm going to want to go darkest in those occlusion shadows within a cast shadow. And I want to sort of figure out, what's my core shadow value. I'm going to say probably a 7 or an 8. At the darkest of the core shadows will probably be an 8, and then they'll be sort of 6, 7, 8 in that range. And even though these are brown eggs, I've pumped as much light as I can in to make them read as regular eggs. But they're a little darker than average, so I'm not going to see a lot of 0s or 1s. I've got a little bit of a specular highlight that I can just leave paper white, and I can come back and get that with an eraser. But for the most part, the center light on these eggs are sort of 1, 2, 3, and then my halftone is going to be that 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's good to identify that before you start out. I'm going to go ahead and go in dark with the occlusion and cast shadows, and then work lighter from there. And let's check back in after sort of my first complete egg. All right, let's start with this middle egg, and I'm going to first define the outside of the egg with the shadow next to it. So I'm going to start by getting the darkest areas around the main egg, so I can essentially find the edges without line, but instead value shapes. So I'm finding those darkest darks and then coming into the egg and starting with the core shadow. And I'm going to keep building on that as I go lighter and lighter out to the lightest parts of the egg, where I will then sort of use my finger to brush and wipe the lightest values, the 10s, 20s, 30s, and then finally come in with my erasers and lighten it up, smear it a little bit, and get the highlight in there. Okay, and I think that's it for this first egg. I'm going to go ahead and wash my fingers so I don't mess up the other eggs, and then I will sort of speed through the remaining 5, and we'll check back in after that. All right, so I think we're getting to a good stopping point for the eggs themselves right now. But I don't want to forget about the background. And I had kind of a sagging blanket underneath here. So it curves and it doesn't give me a good ground line reference. So I want to give myself a little bit of a end of ground plane reference here, so that this area below, I have to look down at it to make sure I'm getting horizontal. this area below the ground plane is from here down, and then sort of a background vertical plane is there. And I want it to be a little darker than the eggs, much like it was here. So I'm going to, I gotta pick, I'm gonna do a little bit lighter on the ground plane, slightly darker for the back plane. And since my light is coming over here, there's gonna be a bit of a gradient slightly from medium to medium dark and light medium to medium, something like that. So I'm gonna get a little contrast by doing some horizontal strokes to reinforce the idea of a ground plane. And I'll need to probably break out my graphite sticks to do this, at least quickly. I could do it with my pencil, but it'll take quite some time. So I'm going to use my pencil to get in tight. So I'm going to speed along here, and I'm just sort of filling in that ground plane with that medium dark value, and then moving on to the vertical plane. I'm going to go around and find the edges with my pencil, and then once I get complete with that, I'm going to grab my graphite stick and just do a little bit of expression in the background, a little angles coming from the eggs, and then finally clean up the lightest spots with my eraser and drop in the highlights at the end. Okay, and here's the end of my eggs. So to recap, I created an envelope to get the overall compositional proportion and establish it on the page. I lightly drew with my lightest pencil to establish the shape and proportion of each egg and the relationship to each other, looking at both the positive space and negative space. And that was my setup. And then I got my darkest graphite pencil and I established the darkest darks and worked from dark to light, egg by egg, getting in all the different kinds of lighting, being highlight, center light, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, occlusion shadow. And thinking about all those things as we go. So now it's your turn. Find some eggs, make a good grouping of those eggs, see if you can stack them, see if you can find a sort of single focus light and get it in front of you, get your value scales in front of you, and go for it. Good luck.